sunlit world of what he believes to be reality. But there is, unseen by most, an underworld, a place that is just as real, but not as brightly lit. A dark side.
You are about to enter another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land of imagination. Next stop, the Twilight.
Race, the final frontier. These are the voyages of counter-racist thought, speech, and action. Baby. Our continuing mission to explore universal humanity, to seek out balance, harmony, and justice, to boldly go where victims very seldom go. Our destination is always the same. We're headed for the long-sought corridors of less confusion.
Just like here in America, the base of this civilization is Africa. But out of this African civilization, and I'm not talking about post-1492, I'm talking about the original human beings that came to this part of the world, known as the Twa Mbuti, the Khoisan, the original first migration of human beings to come to this world were the people derogatorily called pygmies, and there's a very good chance that the populating of this country came through South America, and probably Brazil, and probably from Angola and south. They took what's called the Benguela Current in the early days. The short-statured people, the Khoisan, probably took the early currents and landed it up, and that current, the Benguela Current, takes you right into the mouth of the Amazon River, and that is where we find some of the oldest artifacts of African people on the American hemisphere. After that came the Clovis Folsom people. The Clovis Folsom people are another African people. And they came here and they mated with and joined forces with the Khoisan people. And then the third migration were the Algonquin. The Algonquin also were a melanated people, but had been impacted by climate change. And then came the Inuit that would come through and come up through North America, and they're derogatorily called the Eskimo. And then the fifth and final group of people came in the largest amount of numbers, and these were the people that are called the Asiatic. And these Asiatic coming down came in out of the north, and this is the people that are being given credit for being Native American, and they're not. It is not that they don't have the blood of the original African people. It's that they are not the Native American. They are not the indigenous American. They are the fifth migration of human beings that came to this part of the world and would create a people that are today called the Apache, the Arapaho, the Cherokee, and the Choctaw. But in the beginning blood of the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Blackfoot is the original African people. Now, some don't like to hear it. And I understand. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't like to hear that my history is not quite what I'm teaching. But guess what? Cry your river, build a bridge, and get over it. Because the truth shall set you free.
Mixed race, there's no such thing as mixed race. I included racial classification confusion in the title of the segment, I believe with the hashtag as well in the promotions. there is no such thing as mixed race. There's no such thing biologically as white, black, or when I'm talking about that before, it's just going to be arbitrary. Whatever the most powerful white people, the flagger, Naomi Drake, whatever they decide, that's what it will be. All of it is made up. There's only one race, that is the white race. That confusion is very common. Black race, mixed race, and on and on and on. There's one race, and there's only one reason to belong to a race, that is to practice white supremacy, racism. And even the notion of so-called mixed race, it reifies the notion that there is a so-called white race, as though there is a pure white race and a pure black race. All of that is nonsense and hogwash to the fullest, and it just helps promote confusion about white supremacy, racism.
I'm still learning, Neely Fuller. I'm calling from Cell Block, California. I had an observation I would like him to maybe give his commentary on. It has to do with, in California, it might be across the country, I don't know the world, but a lot of people classified as Mexican and or El Salvadorian, Panamanian, you name it. These are considered or classified or look like non-white people. But when I look at their public records in the public school systems, their parents all have white for race. So I'm trying to figure out why, Mr. Fuller, maybe he can elaborate. I think he explained it before, but maybe it would help people listening. Why would they permit, or who permitted, all these Mexican people to classify their race as white when visually, phenotypically, they don't look white, but they've been permitted to, versus the white or British people who had mixed offspring with natives, and they didn't classify them as white. I know it's to produce confusion, but what is Mr. Fuller's interpretation on that, please?
Oh, okay, Mr. Fuller?
Confusion. That's exactly what the white supremacists do. In order to conquer people and keep them conquered over a long period of time, you must do what? Confuse them. And you confuse them not just in one thing, you confuse them about everything that is of constructive value in all areas of activity. You confuse them in... Hello?
Yeah, Mr. Fuller, could
Yes,
you
ma'am.
give that brief explanation you had before that broke it down about how the Spaniards permitted their mixing, their miscegenation to be classified as white? Could you give that brief explanation?
No, well, apparently, I mean, from what happened was the English-speaking white supremacists, that's
Right.
not all white people, but the white people who believe in white supremacy, some of them spoke English, and then others spoke Spanish. They were all white, okay?
Right.
But it appears on the surface, and this is just my opinion, and I think history will bear it out, or any investigation will bear it out, apparently, the English-speaking white people who believed in white supremacy said, we're going to do something that these Spanish-speaking white people are not doing. We are not going to claim our offspring that we have by these dark-skinned people. We will lay around in the bed with black women, brown women, yellow women, whatnot, females rather, and we will have offspring by them. We will have children by them. We will not claim any of these children as being our own. All right?
Right.
We will claim them as being the same as the category of people that they're in. We'll have plenty of babies. We'll have them all over the place, but we're not going to claim them. Now, we are noticing that the Spanish-speaking white people, they are claiming their children. That's going to come back to haunt them. It's going to cause all kind of confusion. And that apparently is what has happened over all these years. See what I mean? The white people who spoke the language called Spanish had babies by dark-skinned people, just like the white people who spoke English had babies by dark-skinned people. But many of the Spanish-speaking white people say, well, you know, if some of these babies I'm going to claim, but some of them I'm not. But some of them I know they got some color in their skin, but I'm going to claim them and include them as being just like me, even though they don't look exactly like me. All right? So that's where the confusion came from. And that has been carried on from generation to generation. And the English-speaking white people have said, didn't I tell you so? Now you're confusing yourself because you don't even know who your own people are. You know, we don't have that problem, us English-speaking white people, because we saw that coming, okay? So you all made a big mistake, but you're going to have to live with that mistake. But don't force me to live with it. That's the English-speaking white people talking to the Spanish-speaking white people. You're trying to force me to live with your mistake. We told you people thousands of years ago. You don't claim these dark-skinned babies as being your own. You don't include them in your family so that your family looks like it's all what they call mixed and whatnot. That causes confusion among yourselves. We don't make that mistake. We don't claim none of that garbage as being ours.
The Spaniards, Peninsulars, Criollos, and Mestizos. Like the Indians, Spaniards were also diverse in nature and background. Some were soldiers or missionaries directly from Spain. Others came as long-time residents of New Spain, Mexico. Distinctions were made between Criollos, those born in the Americas, and Peninsulars, those born in Spain. Criollos were considered inferior to those who came from the mother country. Those persons of mixed race, Indian and Spaniard, known as Mestizos, were one of the most rapidly growing groups in frontier society. Bearing Spanish names but a culture that was a mixture of Indian and Spanish, they became the backbone of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Mestizos made up the majority of conscripts in the army. They became artisans, traders, and local officials.
Confusion.
Mixed race, there's no such thing as mixed race. I included racial classification confusion in the title of the segment. I believe it with the hashtag as well in the promotions. There is no such thing as mixed race. There's no such thing biologically as white, black, or when I'm talking about that before, it's just going to be arbitrary. Whatever the most powerful white people, the flagger, Naomi Drake, whatever they decide, that's what it will be. All of it is made up. There's only one race, that is the white race. That confusion is very common. Black race, mixed race, and you know, on and on and on. There's one race and there's only one reason to belong to a race, that is to practice white supremacy, racism. And even the notion of so-called mixed race, it reifies the notion that there is a so-called white race, as though there is a pure white race and a pure black race. All of that is nonsense and hogwash to the fullest, and it just helps promote confusion about white supremacy, racism.
Confusion.
Pardo. In the former Portuguese and Spanish colonies in the Americas, Pardas, feminine Pardas, are triracial descendants of Southern Europeans, Indigenous Americans, and West Africans. In some places they were defined as neither exclusively Mestizo, Indigenous American South European descent, nor Mulatto, West African Southern European descent, nor Zambo, Indigenous American West African descent. In colonial Mexico, Pardo became virtually synonymous with mulatto, thereby losing much of its indigenous referencing. In the 18th century, Pardo might have been the preferred label for blackness. Unlike Negro, Pardo had no association with slavery. Casta paintings from 18th century Mexico used the label Negro, never Pardo, to identify Africans paired with Spaniards. Zambo. Zambo, Spanish, or Sambo, or Sambu is a racial term historically used in the Spanish Empire to refer to people of mixed Amerindian and African ancestry. Occasionally in the 21st century, the term is used in the Americas to refer to persons who are of mixed African and Indigenous American ancestry.
Confusion.
¡Sale, ya está listo! This is the Danza de los Diablos, or the Dance of the Devils. It's performed on South Mexico's Pacific coast, the region with the country's largest concentration of Afro-Mexicans.
No es de la África la danza.
These dances don't come from Africa. They are Mexican, but these instruments are African and we make them ourselves. Now the black people have united with the local culture and mixed with the local people along this coast, and we multiplied, and there are now many black people here.
This country is home to more than 1 million Afro-Mexicans, yet these are marginalised and often forgotten communities. They represent around 1% of the national population. Mexico's 2020 census is the first ever to include Afro-Mexican as an ethnic category. Mexico's legacy of slavery began hundreds of years ago.
The slaves in Mexico were in the places where there was mining. This town was founded around the year 1800, most likely by fugitive slaves who escaped to the coastal regions where they could survive on what they found here.
Today, that original African culture still exists in a state dominated by indigenous tradition. Yet this stretch of coastline between Oaxaca and Guerrero states is an impoverished part of the country. There's not much tourism here, and local industry doesn't extend far beyond fishing and agriculture. Yet few black Mexicans leave to seek better opportunities, and those who do find the wider country not very welcoming. Indeed, for Rosa Hernández, the lead councillor of Santo Domingo Armenta, the Afro-Mexican experience is isolating.
We're a vast minority in this country, so that's why many people have never heard of us. They think we're from another country. They don't consider you to be Mexican simply because you're black. But we are Mexicans, and it's only fair that they recognize us, that they value us as much as anyone else.
As the Black Lives Matter movement around the world seeks change and equality for Black Mexico, the challenge for these communities is still at the point of showing they exist. Alistair Baverstock for CGTN, Coajinicuilapa, Mexico.
In case you're not Mexican, Puebla is a city in central Mexico, the 5th largest today with a population of 1.5 million. Really good food, too. It's always been strategic, so the French immediately wanted it while the U.S. was busy with its own civil war.
Exactly. It was an indigenous army. They're at a spot and they see the approaching French forces. And you have to remember, they were intimidating. It was a sight that would scare everybody. This is the best army in the world. And Benito Juarez and his group of ragtag indigenous soldiers happened to defeat them in this battle. The indigenous army had outdated equipment, outdated armor, but they had a strategic location. They were on a hill as the invading French forces came. And if you take anything on military history, you know that's a major advantage. You shoot down while the French had to shoot up. And it reminded folks what was the possibility. You could be outnumbered and outgunned, but as long as you had the drive and you had luck and you had a strategic location, you could win. And I believe that those elements is what got people excited in California and later would be used by the Chicano movement that, yes, we are outnumbered, we are outgunned, but that does not mean we will lose.
So, yeah, Mexico beats France in the Battle of Puebla, 1862, but the following year, the same battle happens. France wins. They take over Mexico. They occupy it for a couple of years, but then Mexico ends up beating the French once and for all. So, meanwhile, in the American Southwest, which, of course, was just Mexico 15 years before all of this, they see that battle, that one battle as a symbolism, as almost a hope of this is how we can resist a foreign imperial power.
Yes, and the reason they did that is because this was an indigenous group fighting a Western European power. It would later become and develop into a David versus Goliath storyline.
So we got former LA Times staffer and part-time actor Daryl Kunitomi to read this newspaper clipping about the Battle of Puebla from the San Francisco Examiner. This is from Cinco de Mayo, 1869.
Dateline Mexican rejoicings. This being the 7th anniversary of the Battle of Puebla, in which the Mexicans defeated the French troops under Lorenzez.
What you can hear in that piece, and the way it was written, that there was jubilation in California. They saw themselves in this same fight as they did with abolitionists in the Americas.
Independence. Its results convinced the Mexicans that if well commanded, they could successfully contend with the best disciplined European troops. This victory revived the drooping spirit of the nation and kept alive the determined resistance which ended in the expulsion of the invaders. General Zaragoza was one of the youngest officers of the Republic. In the evening, an oration and poem will be delivered at Turnverein Hall, and the celebration of the day will conclude by a ball at the same place.
And we have to remember, at the time that the French invaded Mexico, California was a young state, and it was a state that had a number of immigrants. This was not just a place for Mexican and Mexican Americans, but Chileans, folks from Central America and South America. They all came to California for the gold rush. And so there were very strong Spanish language newspapers at the time. When the Battle of Puebla happens on Cinco de Mayo, they equate that to the battle against slavery in the South. Because Napoleon III had made overtures to the South, it was very clear that some of the European powers wanted the South to win.
Wow, so that bears worth repeating. The French wanted the South to win the Civil War.
The people in California, these Latinos, saw themselves in kinship with the indigenous soldiers who won in the Battle of Puebla. They also saw it as an abolitionist fight. So it overtook this excitement in California. And this is the key thing, Gustavo. I've seen a lot of things on social media when we talk about black and brown relations, especially from Wocosos, and we know who Wocosos are.
Yeah, well, Wocoso, really quickly, it's a portmanteau of being woke and a mocoso, which is Mexican Spanish for a snot-nosed brat.
Exactly. You'll go on social media, and whenever I see discussions about present-day police violence or people of color fighting against voting, I really see a simplistic view that Latinos are anti-black, that Mexican Americans have anti-black racism embedded in their identity. And no question, there is a tinge of anti-blackness throughout Latino culture, throughout Latinos. We know them personally, Gustavo. I don't know the word for them, but I call them primos, right? They're in Texas. But at the time, what this tells us about the Battle of Puebla and Cinco de Mayo is that there was an intellectual allyship between Latinos and African Americans in their quest for liberation. This would happen throughout American history. At the same time in Texas, there's the Underground Railroad to Mexico. So Latinos, especially Mexican Americans, saw themselves in kinship with African Americans in their quest for freedom. And the Cinco de Mayo commemoration, as it began, is part of that legacy.
Inbound to immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Esto es una emergencia.
This station has interrupted its regular program at the request of during this emergency, most
we are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Today it's time to stop singing and stop swinging.
To get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular, black classified, and assisting in counter-racist codification. The title of today's episode is The Hidden Hitters of Puebla, Mexico. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I will repeat the title of today's episode. The title of today's episode is The Hidden Hitters of Puebla, Mexico, in commemoration of the American holiday, Cinco de Mayo.
P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program dedicated to creating less confusion for people subject to non-white and particular black classification. Less confusion with the ultimate goal of solving problems. Replace the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice. Immediately. JohnGHorse's Cash App is $JohnGHN, capital G, capital H-O-R-S-E. Feel free to donate if you feel this program is constructive and worth your time.
Feel free to donate if you feel this program is constructive and worth your time. And this is once again your gracious and humble host, John G. Horse. And you have indeed found your family in a peaceful place. And we are going to stay on par, P.A.R. Yes, indeed, pun intended. We are going to stay on code and on track in commemorating the hidden warriors of the Battle of Puebla, May 5th, 1862. You understand me? And I know you're going to ask yourself, oh, John G., why are you commemorating warriors south of the border in Mexico, nevertheless, in the town of Puebla, Mexico, to be exact? Well, if you know anything about old John G prides himself on removing confusions in areas that he feels confusions run rampant. And there's a lot of confusion that runs around American history. Some of us here that were brought up in the United States public school system, and that would be me. I would be one of those individuals, have been beat down with the idea that American history only lies in the borders that the United States reigns supreme. Not that the United States doesn't have influence on the rest of the planet, but when it comes to the matters of the Americas, we only see the Americas as being the United States. But when you look at the map, you look at Canada, North America, Central America, and South America. Well, North America is the United States. You have Central and South and Canada. That's also the Americas, and all of the histories that fall under the umbrella or under the landmass or region that we call the Americas. All of those histories are connected. Now, that's either true or it's not true. And when you're dealing with 1862, May 5th, the town of Puebla, Mexico, you had a so-called rinky-dink, very untrained, undesirable, not well-equipped militia in the town of Puebla, led by Porfirio Diaz. I hope I ain't messing his name up. Porfirio Diaz. Born in Texas, you understand me, but a military giant in Mexico, said to be of so-called Mestizo lineage and genealogy, whatever that means. But to keep up the tradition of confusion, I'm using the terms that the Mexican historians identify or describe Porfirio Diaz as being described as. Let's move on. That being said, Porfirio had a knack for ingratiating himself with the undesirable so-called American aboriginals that were described by the Mexican government as the indigenous or the Indios. He had a knack for getting the Pardos, who were said to be of so-called racial identity and undesirable non-white lineage. He had a knack for recruiting the Negros and self-liberated freedmen who fled or who descended from the self-liberated freedmen who fled from the United States territories down to the Mexican territory and earned their keep. That means they picked up arms and defended the Mexican borders. Yes, indeed. He had a knack for recruiting them. He had a knack for recruiting ambitious, enslaved people that were described as Africans or Negros, to pick up a musket and a machete. Porfirio Diaz, you understand me? This ain't about him. This is about the folks that fought under his leadership and or that fought under their own leadership and understood that it was a ride or die situation. So we're dealing with the Mexican government in 1862 who owed a lot of debts to a lot of countries, and there wasn't a lot of countries willing to go and collect that debt because Mexico's destiny was aligned with the United States' destiny. So to step to Mexico, you had to consider dealing with the wrath of the United States at the time. Oh, but the United States in 1862 was dealing with infighting. The Confederate States of America, who seceded from the United States of America, was having a toe-to-toe with the northern faction, which was the Union, and the Confederates were trying to establish that we didn't want to be a part of that Union no more, and in particular, we wanted to maintain our slave economy, which y'all are telling us that we need to relinquish or stop practicing, which that ain't gonna happen. So the ambitious French general, I believe Napoleon III, had a secret alliance with the Confederate States of America, and he figured once he went down to old rinky-dink Mexico, he wouldn't get no pushback from the southern states, when part of the southern states who seceded was Texas. He had a guaranteed win. He did not anticipate and bank on the fact that there were non-white groups of Americans that would be called non-white Mexicans that was willing to ride and die before they was gonna let the French come in there and kick them around like cans. You understand me? And so the history goes that the rinky-dink, cut-rate militia of non-white Negroes, Pardos, Zambos, self-liberated freedmen, and mulattoes, whatever those terms mean, gave the French that word. And old John G gives a black self-respect salute to all those fellow black classifieds and non-whites for doing what any self-righteous human being would do for their best interests. And I'm not gonna be doing all the hooping and hollering. I'm gonna let some excerpts from Kelly Little Hernández's book titled Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands acknowledge these receipts. You know how we do here on People Activity Radio. Let me cue that clear.
Taking advantage of the tumult in Mexican politics, the United States annexed the Mexican state of Tejas in 1845. Unsatisfied by the 172 million acres of new land, Anglo-American settlers, especially slaveholders dreaming of a cotton empire extending all the way to the Pacific, demanded more, prompting President James Polk to order the invasion of Mexico in 1846. Troops soon stormed Mexico City and raised the U.S. flag over the National Palace, forcing Mexico to cede another 336 million acres, more than half of the country's remaining land. At the close of the war in 1848, U.S. treaty negotiators considered seizing even more land but, ultimately, decided that acquiring only Mexico's sparsely populated northern territory would balance the settlers' hunger for new real estate with their disinclination to incorporate a large number of Mexican people, whom Anglo-Americans generally disparaged as mongrels unfit for U.S. citizenship. As John O'Sullivan, the journalist who coined the term manifest destiny, later warned, the annexation of the country, Mexico, to the United States would be a calamity. 5 million ignorant and indolent half-civilized Indians, with 1,500,000 free Negroes and mulattoes, would scarcely be a desirable encumbrance, even with the great natural wealth of Mexico. Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan agreed, "We do not want the people of Mexico either as citizens or subjects. All we want is a portion of territory which they hold, generally uninhabited, or, where inhabited at all, sparsely so." Drawn down the belly of the Rio Grande River and out west to the Pacific Ocean, the new U.S. Mexico border was a 2,000-mile color line between what many Anglo-Americans regarded as white America and mongrel Mexico. 5 million ignorant and indolent half-civilized Indians, with 1,500,000 free Negroes and mulattoes, would scarcely be a desirable encumbrance, even with the great natural wealth of Mexico. When the Liberals won the Reform War in 1861, Juarez retook the presidency, determined to implement the liberal vision for life in Mexico, but he soon learned how much the decades of coups, disease, invasion, and tumult had cost the treasury. Mexico was broke, drowning in $80 million of international debt. Juarez announced that Mexico would suspend payments on the debt for 2 years. His goal was to buy enough time to establish a new tax and revenue system, allowing Mexico to pay off its European creditors without bankrupting the treasury. The debt moratorium proved to be a political disaster. Since the ousting of Emperor Iturbide, a small group of Mexican Criollos had regretted the War of Independence. They had hoped that independence would allow a domestic elite of Mexicans of European descent, white classified, to seize full political and economic control of Mexico, but with the rise of the liberals, the nation's indigenous, Pardo, Zambo, self-liberated freedmen and mixed-race majority upended their plan. For decades, Mexican Criollos had visited the royal courts of Europe, begging a monarch to occupy Mexico, protect their properties, defend the Catholic Church, and enforce the colonial social order. They wanted a white empire to rule in Mexico. Few European monarchs wanted anything to do with the Criollos' plan. Mexico was a political quagmire. Decades earlier, in 1823, the United States government had issued its Monroe Doctrine, vowing to protect any independent nation in the Americas from European colonization. Invading Mexico was thus tantamount to invading the United States. No one in Europe was willing to test the hemisphere's most powerful republic, no one except Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who, in 1848, seized the French presidency and convinced the French Congress to name him emperor. He titled himself Napoleon III, after his uncle Napoleon I, known as Napoleon the Great. Napoleon III dreamed of rebuilding the French Empire in the Americas. The 1763 Treaty of Paris had forced France to cede most of its territories in North America. Then, in 1803, Napoleon I sold the sprawling Louisiana Territory to the United States, relinquishing France's last major North American holding. The next year, in 1804, enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, finished a decades-long revolt by killing off slaveholders, ousting French authorities, and declaring Haiti an independent republic. By the 1820s, the French Empire was effectively over. For years, Napoleon III pored over maps of Mexico while chain-smoking and plotting the resurrection of the French Empire in the Americas. While he waited for an opportunity to strike, Benito Juarez defaulted on Mexico's international debt. A few weeks later, the United States erupted in civil war. The timing seemed perfect. Juarez's debt moratorium presented a pretext to invade Mexico, while the Civil War lowered the protective shield around the Americas that the Monroe Doctrine had raised. The situation in the United States is very favorable. Napoleon III observed from Paris Point 30 in April 1862, with Union and Confederate forces battling at Shiloh and New Orleans. Napoleon III dispatched French troops to invade Mexico and recruited the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria von Habsburg-Lothringen, a young royal with no country to rule, to serve as the titular head of the French invasion of Mexico. Napoleon III named the Austrian Archduke Emperor Maximilian. From the port of Veracruz, French troops marched across mountain roads and jungle paths to Mexico City. The conservatives welcomed them at every stop. Juarez's guerrilla fighters harassed them, but the better provisioned French troops pushed on. By May 5, 1862, they had arrived in the town of Puebla, their last stop before Mexico City. Armed with little more than the old brown Bessies left behind by U.S. troops during their invasion 14 years before, General Diaz Zapotec unit stopped them. French troops gathered on a small hill outside Puebla, their new guns glinting in the sun. At noon, the 1st French Battalion stormed the main road into Puebla. 2 further battalions attacked from the east and the west, raining cannon fire on the nearly 6,000 liberal soldiers pinned between them. Soon, only Diaz's unit was left, stationed in a church in the center of town. As French soldiers poured into Puebla, Diaz and his squadron burst from the church into hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, 253 men were killed, 436 were wounded. But Diaz's troops kept fighting, for hours. A woman named Margarita Magan brought water to the fighters. Among them, she met Teodoro Flores, with whom she would later have 3 sons, who, in time, would become some of General Diaz's most vocal critics. But on this day, long before their boys were born, Margarita Magan and Teodoro Flores fought side by side with Diaz to stop the French troops from reaching Mexico City. Eventually, the French forces were chased out of Puebla, closing the door to the Mexican capital. As the general in charge of the campaign later admitted, it was Diaz and his fighters who drove off the French troops con Empino y Bazaria with determination and bravery. The triumph at Puebla made Porfirio Diaz a legend. Proud officials in Oaxaca gifted him a massive ranch, La Noria. His family would never again live in poverty. The world marveled at the Mestizo general who had led Zapotec, Pardo, self-liberated freedmen and Negro fighters to victory against Napoleon's army. The victory is still commemorated. We call it Cinco de Mayo. The world marveled at the Mestizo general who had led Zapotec, Pardo, self-liberated freedmen and Negro fighters to victory against Napoleon's army. The victory is still commemorated. We call it Cinco de Mayo.
And there you have it, Cinco de Mayo, Mexican history, the Battle of Puebla, 1862. Baby. You understand me? And this is American history, in particular, specifically Central American Mexican history, which directly affected north of the border conflict that was going on between the North and the South of the United States. Had those non-white, black classified mulatto, Pardo, Zambo, Indios took a whooping, France at that time would have been able to commandeer the country of Mexico and supply the Confederacy with fresh ammunitions that those of us who follow history suspect would have resulted in a victory for the Confederate States of America. Yes, indeed. And it is only coincidence, it is only the ancestors speaking down upon us that it was people subject to non-white in particular, black classification that put in that work. Now, whether you want to recognize that or not, that is your prerogative. That is your choice to make. VGQ, Victims Guaranteed Qualification. But old John G. think that it is appropriate to recognize anybody subject to non-white, in particular black classification, that had the fortitude, the intestinal fortitude, men, women, and children, the guts, the courage, the self-respect to pay the ultimate price for whatever they perceive freedom to be at that time in the toxic environment wherever they found themselves. Now that is either true or not true. And to all people who have to suffer victim status under this evil system that we call racism, white supremacy, whatever you do in response to it, VGQ, Victims Guaranteed Qualifications, but for those non-whites on May 5th in Puebla, Mexico, Black Self-Respect Salute. Put some respect on their name. Cinco De Mayo. Baby. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.